And today, after more than 50 votes in Congress to repeal or weaken this law, after a presidential election based in part on preserving or repealing this law, after multiple challenges to this law before the Supreme Court, the Affordable Care Act is here to stay.
Coming to you from Southern California, this is Mindset, mental health news and information. I'm your host, James Curtis. That, of course, was President Barack Obama speaking today in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision upholding, once again, the Affordable Care Act, the latest challenge to it. One of the big issues for mental health, given the increased overall access to health care provided by the Affordable Care Act, is something called Parity.
Health insurance coverage is as boring as toast, but it's really, really important. I'm Sita Deal. I'm the Director of State Policy and Advocacy for NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness.
My conversation with Sita Deal of NAMI a little bit later on in the program, the idea of parity, getting access, challenging your insurance company in light of the provisions in the Affordable Care Act. But first, my conversation with Kimberly Leonard, healthcare reporter for U.S. News and World Report.
Kimberly Leonard, healthcare reporter with U.S. News and World Report.
Kimberly Leonard, thank you so much for joining me today. There's breaking news today about the Supreme Court's decision regarding the Affordable Care Act, and you covered that story. Give us an update.
That's right. Well, today the Supreme Court ruled that federal subsidies that were given to citizens in 34 states that use them are legal under the law, that they were not meant to be distributed solely through the states that created their own exchanges, which are essentially websites that people use to purchase health insurance and get at a discounted rate because of tax subsidies.
Now, there's been a lot of controversy, obviously, over the years since the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, also known as ObamaCare. A ton of efforts on the part of the Congress to repeal in part or in its entirety the Affordable Care Act. Have you been able to gauge any reaction from either Capitol Hill or the individuals who are behind the lawsuit that got this case before the Supreme Court?
Yes, I have. I've been reporting on it and getting a lot of reactions. Those who are opposed to the Affordable Care Act are very disappointed about the outcome. They feel that the federal government has overreached and that the IRS rewrote the law in terms of how the subsidies were to be distributed. Ultimately, I think some of the justices didn't want to disrupt the system as it was. The projections show that if the court had ruled against the administration, then about 6.4 million people could have lost their health insurance because they would no longer be able to afford it.
The plaintiffs in this case, it's King versus Burwell. Who was King, who was Burwell?
Well, Burwell is the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, which is the agency that's responsible for carrying out the details of the health care law. The case was brought originally by various groups, libertarian groups and conservative groups, who read the law and concluded that the language of the law said subsidies to pay for health insurance needed to be distributed only through marketplaces that were established by the states. Now, what happened was there were so few states that actually ended up establishing their own exchanges, but the federal government had created its own. Now, the administration concludes that the subsidies were always meant to be distributed through both channels, but those who were the plaintiffs and those who were against the law say that it actually was supposed to push states to create their own exchanges, and that's where the conflict lies.
Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the court's majority opinion, as you note in your article, talked about this ruling, not so much it seemed in a legally analytical way, but more in a deductive reasoning kind of way. And by that I mean, they talked a lot in the opinion, and you note in your article the court's discussion about the tremendous impact that ruling otherwise would have had if they had upheld the individuals who were against Obamacare, against the ACA, upheld that point of view that indeed the term and the phrase established by the state meant that the subsidies would go away, it would have been catastrophic. That seemed to be a significant part of the court's reasoning. Am I reading that right?
Yes, that's right. And that is also what I'm hearing from various experts, and that's what the administration was saying all along. They had always expressed confidence in their position, but they knew that if the court were to rule against them, then people wouldn't be able to afford subsidies. What subsidies do is they allow health insurance to be less expensive for people who make a certain income. So we're talking generally middle-income Americans who aren't getting health insurance through an employer and use this exchange, which is a marketplace of various insurance plans with various benefits at various levels of care, and are able to purchase a plan that they want. Now, they're able to do that because they have the subsidies to pay for it, but without them, it becomes so much more expensive to pay for health insurance. And so, in that case, millions of people could have lost their insurance, and it would have been very difficult for them to keep up with their care.
One of the subjects having to do with the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, that you've covered extensively has been the benefit and sometimes the problems that individuals who are seeking coverage for mental health care and mental illnesses have had. This ruling seems to go at least one step further to giving folks a little bit more security that to the extent that there is coverage for mental health and mental illnesses, they don't have to worry about that going away.
Yes, that's definitely correct. And even the president today, in his response to the ruling from the White House, said that the law still needed to be improved. And I think that the coverage for people with mental illness is going to be a topic that we'll see coming up a lot, because there are still some definitions that have not been clearly defined, because there is still some terminology that hasn't been clearly defined, including what parity is, and including what sort of care gets covered for what sort of illness. And until some of those questions get resolved, there's going to be a lot of advocacy groups who are trying to understand it better and who are trying to make sure that people get the care that they need.
President Obama is a lame duck president. This act, the Affordable Care Act, he got accomplished in his first term. Do you see this encouraging or emboldening the president to go those further steps with respect to clarification on those issues, or will that be something that will be pushed primarily by advocacy groups?
Well, I think it is something that would probably come out of the Department of Health and Human Services. They're the ones who have to define specifically what the services are if they're not being followed. We had a few issues that came up with contraceptive coverage earlier this year, and at that point, the department released a statement saying precisely which benefits needed to be covered for contraception for women.
Let's spend a moment on the dissent. Justice Antonin Scalia was joined by Justices Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas, the most conservative justices on the Supreme Court. What was their point? Was it just a plain reading of the language that was at issue, defied, or was in opposition to this outcome?
Well, that's right. Well, they believe that the law should be applied as written, and they wanted to uphold that portion of the law, and they were simply outnumbered.
Have you done any research, Kimberly, about whether or not this is something that's unusual for Supreme Court to do? Indeed, there is clearly the plain meaning of these words, quote, established by the state, and the conclusion that these justices reached. Is there any precedent for this type of analysis on the part of the Supreme Court? Is there any sort of backlash that might happen or could happen that could undermine this ruling, or does the Supreme Court get the final word on this?
Well, they get the final word in terms of who receives subsidies, but that doesn't mean that Congress can't, a couple of years from now, under a new president, have a law that would repeal the Affordable Care Act. That's certainly a possibility. In terms of whether the terminology is acceptable or not, there are some news reports that have emerged saying simply that it was a drafting error, that the law was put together hastily. The law was passed without a single Republican vote. So there isn't a lot of support for it amongst Republicans. Now, there is support for portions of the law. For example, nobody is arguing that people shouldn't receive health insurance under their parents' plan until age 26. That's a very popular portion of the law, and that's a portion that Republicans have indicated they would want to keep. Now, they've come up with various versions of what they think a new health care law would look like, but so far there hasn't been a ton of support for any particular law, and under President Obama, then they wouldn't be able to pass anything because he has veto power.
So the only hope that the Republican Congress, as it's presently constituted at least, would have to repeal seems like having a new president that would be in favor of that type of repeal. On the other hand, there's been a lot of talk, in addition to the numerous efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act, on the part of the Republican Congress about coming up with their own plan. There have been what seems like fits and starts to that effort. From what you can tell in your coverage of this issue and Congress, has any effort on the part of the Republican Congress gained significant traction?
Not in particular. I think the main probably support would be for the medical device tax, which basically puts the tax over the next few years on groups that produce medical devices, and there has been some support on that end from both parties, but that's such a small portion of the law that isn't really something that the regular consumer would be too concerned about. It does help balance out a lot of portions of the law, which is an expensive law, but Republicans are looking for ways to at least chip away at it in whatever way that they can.
U.S. News and World Report's Kimberly Leonard. You can find her online on her Twitter feed, Leonard, K-L-L-E-O-R-N-A-R-D-K-L, at usnews.com. And we'll have a link to her article on our social media and an extended interview with Kimberly Leonard on the podcast. You can find more on these and other mental health stories on the Mindset Report, available online at mindsetreport.com. The Mindset Report, your most comprehensive online source for mental health news. Now, you heard Kimberly Leonard mention the idea of parity. A few weeks ago, I had a conversation with Sita Deal with the National Alliance on Mental Illness. She talks about the meaning of parity, efforts to get the same level of treatment covered by insurance companies for mental health as they provide for physical health conditions, and what individuals can do.
I'm Sita Deal. I'm the Director of State Policy and Advocacy for NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness.
Thank you so much for joining me, talking to me today about the idea of parity and the report that NAMI, the National Association on Mental Illness, has put out. But I want to back up and get a little bit basic about NAMI. I've mentioned it a lot on the show. I'm a member of my local affiliate. Tell folks what NAMI is and why they're so important in the area of mental health and education about mental illnesses.
NAMI is a national grassroots organization of people living with mental illness, whether personally or family members or both. And we're really the voice of lived experience when it comes to schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, major depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, the mental health conditions that really derail people's lives. So we're, really focused on getting people the right help at the right time, helping people understand this very confusing mental health system we have in the United States, ensuring that the system becomes more user-friendly, which it really isn't right now.
And along that line of being user-friendly or not, tell us, why was it important to reduce to writing what the status of mental illness and mental health resources are in this country?
Well, having health insurance coverage is absolutely key to getting early and effective mental health care. And with the NAMI